Hello and welcome strategy battle gamers to a brand new series on the GBHL podcast. You are here with your GBHL channel host GBHL James. I'm going to be joined in this series by my friend from Top Table Wargaming, terrain extraordinaire. It's Cool Steve, everybody. Now, of course, this is a very exciting time, isn't it, Steve, for Middle Earth strategy battle game, isn't it?
It is, yep.
Certainly is. We've got lots to look forward to with the Middle Earth team cracking on hard at work. And of course, a big topic of conversation is what we would like to see from Middle Earth strategy battle gaming. Now, this is going to be a series of videos, and first of all, what we are going to be doing is looking at the Hobbit rulebook, and we're going to look at rules that we would like to see going forward with Middle Earth strategy battle gaming. So we're going to be making our way through these rules, and we're going to start things off with characteristics, and it's probably one of the biggest things that Jamie and I have talked about over the last few years is talking about fight value. Out of all of the characteristics, it's probably one which causes the most amount of debate, isn't it, Steve? Yeah,
it has. I think when we moved on to the Hobbit and all the new profiles come in, it became more of an issue. Just because just going up to fight 10 maximum just didn't really cut the mustard for some of the heroes, did it?
Certainly, as the Hobbit profiles have come out, we've seen a lot of Fight 7, where Fight 6 was previously so important. Heroes that seem to be the mightiest in Middle Earth, obviously staying at fight value 6. Now, over the course of the series, we will be looking at the various source books, whether they're the old source books of Kingdoms of Men, Free Peoples and the like, and the new Hobbit ones, and we will go through all of those profiles and look at profiles that we think would need to be adjusted going forwards, in our own opinion. But what we're talking about here is actually potentially either looking at rescaling fight value for Fight 12, specifically looking at heroic striking, which we'll come on to later in the video. But it's also been bandied around, I'm not sure what you think about this, but a lot of people who play war games have mentioned the idea that they do feel that strategy battle game is a game of sixes. Now, I personally don't feel, I feel like if you're rolling sixes in any game, you're probably doing pretty well on a D6 game. But it has been suggested that maybe fight value plus your highest dice in the dual roll, and using the accumulative total of that to work out who wins the dual roll, rather than just a straight roll off, and then if you're matched, only then fight value comes in. Of course, that's going to allow better heroes to have a bit of a stronger stand. What do you think about it, Steve?
Yeah, it's a good idea. I think anything that's just going to make it not as straightforward, and like, you can sort of see where people are coming from, saying that it's more of a game that you roll sixes, but like you say, I mean, any game, if you're rolling a D6, 6 is what you're striving for. So if you can mix that up, use the fight value to change that up, then yeah, it's going to make it more interesting. So
just a couple of little suggestions there. These are not things that are going to happen. They're just a couple of little ideas. Do we think that these changes are going to come in? No, not these particular changes. So what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the next topic. And the next thing that we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at line of sight. Now, one thing I would like to point out with this video is that this is not a video going through the rules from a technical standpoint and creating some form of FAQ. There are lots and lots of things in here that have been clarified over on the official Games Workshop FAQ and also on the GBHL FAQ, as well as things that are still ambiguous. We're not going to be talking about them. We're going to talk about some of the fundamental principles in the game, aren't we, Steve?
Yeah.
And this is one that you actually pointed out. We're talking about line of sight.
Yeah, true line of sight. It's a good idea. It's a nice thought. It's quite cool, but especially in tournament play, it just doesn't work for me. I think that it should be your base size. The line of sight should be your base size. You draw a 25mm line from your base to your target's base. If anything goes over that, obscures that 25mm line, it's in the way. Just for the simple reason that you could have miniatures posed jumping over rocks, jumping over fences, standing up straight. They're all different. You could get a hand in the way that goes through a line. People say, oh, there's an in the way. If it's clear from base to base. If it's not, it just clears a lot of things up in my eyes. And the height would stay the same, obviously. Yeah, it's a very interesting point, because of course the reason why Games Workshop use true line of sight is that they like to see that the model is it's going to be dynamic. They're fighting, their arms going to be flailing everywhere, so there is that rule, of course, that if you can see main parts of the body or arms, etc. But that does mean that some games that things can come up to dispute. Now, I'm a big fan of true line of sight. I do actually like true line of sight, but I understand what you mean. Playing Guild Ball, they do have an idea where there is a ball path
token, which I guess would be the closest thing to something being projectile from model to model in that game, and that keeps it really clear. So it's just like a perspex thing, which would be the size of a base, the size of the base of what you're going for, and you could place that over. Again, is that something that we think that we're going to see cleared up? Probably not. It works reasonably well in the game, and of course in ideal situations you want to be able to get down, and even if two opponents can't agree whether it's line of sight or not, you're just able to roll a d6 and resolve it that way. So that's looking at line of sight. So we're going to come back in here looking at the rule book to the next topic of conversation where we think it would really improve the game, and that's looking at prone models and having to lie your wonderfully painted metal models down on the table in tournament play. Something that you're quite passionate about, Steve.
Yeah, I don't like doing it. If I spend a lot of time painting a model, the last thing I want to do is lie it down on especially if it's a hard surface like a realm of battle, or if it's like a wooden table or something like that, or a piece of terrain that's made from plastic. I mean, the gaming mats you can get now are nice and soft, they're not too bad, but even still, you don't want to lie them down. You've put a lot of time in them, you've spent a lot of money on them, for starters, and they're just going to get scratched, chipped, marked, and it's not good. Plus, it messes up the control zone.
Well, yeah.
Where you can charge, there's the main thing, but yeah, I don't like it.
Well, the chip parts are always the bits that you highlighted last as well, so it's tips of noses and top of hair and ears and tips of swords and the like, which means you've got to go through the whole process again. But as you mentioned at the end there, it's not just the love for the hobby side and the miniature and the fact that you painted that model which causes the problems. It also causes a few problems in games, particularly in tournament play, with regards to where control zones start and end, people making sure that they lie down miniatures and even stand them up in different positions. And as such, I think it would be much better and much clearer if you could simply just assign a token to a model just to say that that model was not prone. That's definitely a change that I would love to see. Is it something that we think that we'll see? Hobby strategy battle gaming isn't really a game of tokens, but it'd be wonderful that if that was included in some form of rules change in the future, that it at least gave you permission to do that rather than lying down and ruining your wonderful models. So we're actually going to jump back into the rulebook now because we are up to the shooting phase. Now this is something that we're going to mention later when we start looking at war gear as well, but the rules for shooting do seem to work quite well. I know that shooting was very powerful in the Lord of the Rings rules, and of course the move shoot penalties have had, I think in some ways, a positive impact on the game. Yeah. Barring one area, and that one area is of course
throwing weapons.
Throwing weapons. We believe that you should be able to move your full distance and there be no penalty to what it is on your shoot value to use throwing weapons, because they are something which have disappeared from the game completely. They're quite expensive, and because of that penalty we just don't see them doing.
No, I mean I've played in games where people have got throwing weapons because they might be already in the profile, and to be honest they just don't bother me. Like, I'm charging in, oh he's got a throwing weapon, I'm like okay, good luck rolling that 6. They just rarely, once in a blue moon they do it. So they're kind of worthless.
Yeah, and I, as a Rohan player, would love to be in a situation where it was worth paying a couple of points for a throwing spear, which could be so good, but only hitting 1/3 of the times instead of half of the time is going to be very frustrating. I'm sure there's lots of dwarves and grimhammers out there that would say exactly the same. And wood elves. When do you see a wood elf with a throwing dagger these days? Never. So we're actually going to come back in now because we're already up to the heroic stats. So we're talking about might, will and fate. Now these are very well thought out areas of the game which make Lord of the Rings very unique, and a game about heroes in my opinion, which it should be in lots and lots of ways. Lots of the heroics are absolutely fantastic, but there is one which is glaringly obviously needs a tweak. Which one's that, Steve?
Heroic strike.
Certainly does. Too many situations I feel where both heroes go up to fight 10, match at fight 10, and you end up having a 50-50 roll off regardless. It's just another area where you have to save your might too, so your might's not being used for cool moments like bumping the dice roll up or your heroic moves or heroic combats, which are much more dynamic in the game, but you almost feel like you have to save that might point for the inevitable heroic strike cost versus other heroes. Yeah,
I think when you especially if you Thranduil fight 7 and you're going to heroic strike against him, and it's like you make it, if you're the Thranduil player, you have to use that might, and it feels like a waste because you've brought him because he's fight 7. You know, you're going to go up to fight 10, you're going to be very unlucky if you don't. So going up to fight 12 would help a lot.
Now there is a positive and a negative that comes along with Heroic Strike. Of course, it enables even the lowly goblin captains to be able to get themselves up and to compete and contend with some of the very best heroes. However, it seems to be quite a big opinion out there that of course people like Aragorn winning his combats, they like Legolas. Now the risk could still be there, but one really good way, I feel, Steve feels and a few other people feel, would be a good way of tweaking it, is to allow that fight value scale to go up to 12. So if things can Heroic Strike up to 12, then of course if Gil-galad rolls a 6 and the Goblin King rolls, Goblin Captain rolls a 6 for example, then Gil-galad is still going to win because he is a better fighter. There isn't that cut-off point. You know, Gil-galad of course only needing to roll a 1 anyway. So I think that Heroic Strike is probably going to be an area, or would be an area, that if I was in charge I would have a look at. Let's move on to that next topic. So the next part of the game, which has hugely changed the meta of strategy battle gaming from Lord of the Rings to The Hobbit, is looking at monsters, and in particular brutal power attacks. Let's start things off with Rend. Rend, it's almost a given. It's almost a given in lots of situations.
Yeah, I like Rend. It's a good rule. It's probably the most used rule after Hurl that I use when I do use monsters. But yeah, it can be, if you're trapped, knocked down, you're not in a good place. You're not in a good place, and it maybe is a little bit too powerful on them occasions. What do you think?
I think that when a model is trapped or knocked down, I think that if I think that there should be the choice there, because at the moment it just seems clear you might as well Rend. Most things defense is going to be a lot higher than its strength, so it almost becomes an auto thing. Now anything that becomes an auto, or like an auto either way, so it's happening all of the time or never happening at all, these are the areas of the game that we would probably look at trying to improve and create a little bit of balance or risk reward. And I think with Rend, I think if you're trapping a model or there is a model that is knocked down and you opt to Rend, I don't think you should get the doubled strikes. So I think you've got to have that choice there. Do you hit against the defense but you've got double strikes because they're trapped, or do you opt to Rend and you just get the number of attacks that you're actually rending? I think that would be a really good way of looking at Rend and giving that real option for a player. Do I Rend or do I get the double strikes? Because
it's not taking that bonus away from you, then you've got the option. Yeah, I agree, that's a good thing.
The next area to look at is Hurl. Now, Hurl has created much debate, and it has definitely changed strategy battle gaming in so many ways. No longer can you just feed a model to a monster once per turn, and of course Hurl has affected the meta. We no longer see that many defense 3 armies doing particularly well in tournaments because Hurl is incredibly powerful. Yeah. Now I think Hurl works quite well. We're not here of course to clarify the rules, and of course the Great British Hobbit League FAQ has definitely looked at and discussed with Games Workshop where the points of the model are thrown to and the like, which has cleared that area. That's not what we're looking at. But you would like Hurl to be reduced in effectiveness.
I think when it's the difference in strength plus a D6, D6 seems like a lot. I mean, we had a slight discussion before filming, and D3 seems like it's still really powerful, but you know, it's going to take that edge off, taking out a whole line of wood elves or hobbits. You know, if you're hurling like 8-9 inches, that is really bad, and it can ruin a game. I think when that happens, if you have a really good hurl and it takes out a lot of your opponents, it can ruin the game. So I think D3 plus the difference in strength would just ease that off. You'd still get the benefits of the hurl, but it wouldn't be as devastating as a D6.
Now I actually slightly disagree with Steve because I think that if you're a monster player and you manage to get in on a flank and you work towards that, then it rewards that tactical sort of side of getting in on the flank of a battle line and being able to effectively decimate it, and it's down to the defending player to try and defend against that. I think visually on the table, strength plus D6, it works. It looks like it's about the right kind of distance, and I do think it's brought something positive to the game. But we're interested, what are your opinions? Get yourself into the comments below and let us know. So now we're going to look at Monstrous Cavalry, a specific set of rules which do seem to just be for Felbeast, most of the time, for Felbeast.
Yeah.
Now that has changed a little bit because we do have Radagast on Eagle, but for a very long time it did seem like it was a lot of extra bonuses for what is a pretty cheap profile upgrade.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with monstrous cavalry rules. I personally just think it boils down to, like you say, fell beasts are too cheap. You mentioned Radagast pays a lot more for his eagle. I know his eagle can stick around, and that's probably why, but I think fell beasts should be more expensive. It's just horrible to play against, and I know you're going to get your fell beast players who are just screaming at the screen now saying stop being soft, but it's not fun. It's not fun half the time. With, you know, if you got fell beast, you got magic as well, so double that up, you're in trouble. It's tough, and sometimes, yeah, it can just ruin it for you, really.
Yeah, and we'll come on to talking about fell beasts specifically as a piece of war gear when, of course, we get to them, looking at the Mordor and the rest of the evil source books when we get to them. But it's worth bringing it up now, because if you're going to look at monstrous cavalry as a set of rules, they seem pretty fine if they're then costed right into the upgrades and profiles that do get them. So that's something that we'll probably talk about later on down the line. So now on to weapons and war gear. Weapons and war gear. Now, a really good point, remember, weapons and war gear is going to be covering special strikes, which is definitely going to be a big part of some of the changes that I would like to see, and probably what a few people would like to see going forwards with Middle Earth strategy battle gaming. But one rule that might be really nice to see is perhaps one that encouraged people to use the weapons and war gear that are either already on the model, or those models are already modelled with, and there are versions of, already taken. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that should come into play. I don't think you should be giving Wood Elves axes. I don't think you should be giving Wolves axes. By all means, if you convert into you've got a different look to your army, and you've got an orc with a sword, and you convert him to have an axe, that's fine, because there are already orcs with axes and two-handed axes. But giving models axes who have never had axes, were never manufactured with axes, you know, and they're not in the profile, don't do it. Don't do it, just don't do it. It shouldn't be allowed. It's horrible, horrible.
Now at the moment, as things stands, it is allowed, but what we have seen with some of the newer releases from The Hobbit is that in the weapons and war gear, it's actually listed what type of weapon those models take. So for example, the new Mirkwood Rangers, they take the daggers, don't they? They take the daggers, so you cannot model an axe onto a Mirkwood Ranger. And that kind of approach, maybe when looking back over the source books, if there was ever that dream situation where we had a one rule book, or we had a book which covered every single profile, that would definitely be something that I would like to see. Let's talk about two-handed weapons. Now, of course, in some of the changes to the Hobbit rules, two-handed weapons, it became an optional whether you actually went into the combat and had to use the two-handed weapon, because every model is now assumed as having a piece of a hand weapon. Yeah. That's right. They're all assumed to have a hand weapon. What do you think about that, Steve? Do we see many two-handed weapons on the scene? Do you see them be used? When do we see them be used? Yeah,
I think you see them. I see them. Not lots, but you do see them. People put them in forces just to have that different option, I think. I like the idea of two-handed weapons. I rarely use it because of the penalty of having the -1 in the duel. For me, I think it would be tweaked maybe a little bit to, if you chose to go two-handed, you wouldn't get a deficit on your dice roll, but you might have a -1 to your defence. So it becomes a kind of like a piercing strike. Maybe it might be a little bit too like piercing strike, but I would prefer that idea, but that's just my opinion.
It comes down to whether we see these things on the battlefield, and whether if you can take them as a choice, would you pay the point to use them? And I think with the emergence with special strikes, full stop, so the emergence of them coming along, and with special strikes being able to be free, I know that when I've been list building and creating lists, that is very, very rare, unless I have just a strength 3 heavy army. I very, very rarely would look to include any form of two-handed weapon at all and pay the points to do that. I'd rather have some more troops, for example. And I think that's where the issue comes in. You of course have things like berserkers, which they take them, they get them as part of their war gear. So as such, we tend to see those around. But in the armies where you've got them as a choice, in the more competitive builds, they won't be taken, because the -1 to the dual roll is perhaps a little bit too much, and using the +1 to wound is going to be very situational, usually in situations where you're already trapping something or you really need to kill something that's towards the end of the game. So clearly something could be looked at there, whether they were free, effectively, a free option, because I don't think it necessarily warrants being. You could almost use them like it's a special strike option rather than something that you pay more for. I don't think it's necessarily worth an extra point to have that, because it's already got the pluses and the minuses.
Yeah, you've already got the penalty. Yeah,
you've already got the penalty, so you don't need the extra penalty of paying the point. So that's probably what I would look at doing. I'd move it into the rest of the special strike categories, remove the points cost for it, because there's already a penalty in the dual roll.
Yeah.
Another area when looking at weapons and war gear, which becomes a real hot topic of debate, especially with players who used to be involved in the game years ago, who then get back into the Hobbit game, is about spears being able to support larger bases. Now this is something that has come in relatively recently in the life cycle of SBG. Of course, you can now get a lowly Moria Goblin with spear supporting a cave troll. What do you think about that, Steve?
I think a bit of common sense really comes into it, so it does look a bit silly. I think, yeah, you should only be able to support models that have the same base size. You know, when you see something like that, it doesn't look realistic. I know it's a game, but yeah, come on, you know, it's not the same. It's not right.
It's an interesting one as a rule to get removed out of the rules, because it seems to be something which wouldn't clunk up the game too much to have that as a way of thinking. So if that was something that I don't think it would matter either way, but it's definitely one where there is the odd eyebrow raised in the Hobbit SBG community. Another area of spear support which maybe doesn't necessarily make sense, but would tie in then with the base sizes and being able to support base sizes, is of course being able to support a flying model. Now, of course, the battlefield is very fluid, isn't it, Steve? Yeah. You know, that model would be up and down, up and down, up and down, on the ground, in the air, and the like. But being able to support a fell beast or being able to support an eagle,
I think it should be in the no category. You're not allowed to do that.
But that would get cleared up, of course, if you went for base sizes.
Yeah.
So now we come on to special strikes themselves. Now, special strikes were a hot topic of debate when they came out. So many people were against them, and lots of other people really liked them. Now, I have to say that I actually kind of like the idea of the special strikes, especially because this is a skirmish game, and it can really change up and make every single combat that little bit differently. But they are slightly flawed as they stand.
Yeah, they are. I mean, I'm like you, I like the special strikes, I'm a big fan of them. I think it brings another aspect to the game, rather than everyone just being the same. Do you know what I mean? You can't do anything different. And I think you wanted to move on to Bash, being the first one.
Yeah, let's talk about Bash. So Bash is one that we don't really see too often.
You don't see it very often, and I think the reason you don't see it very often is because when you read it, it's not complicated, but to go through it, you've got extra dice rolls. You said before that unnecessary dice rolls. And I think that's the reason why we don't see it, and they don't really need to have that extra dice roll. Yeah,
it's a bit of a problem. It's a bit of a problem. As it stands at the moment, you fight as normal. You fight as normal, but then at that point you opt to Bash before you go into that, and then you have to roll a further d6 and compare the strengths. Now, if you combine that all into one roll, as Steve says, and just concise it so that when you actually roll for the dual roll, you're already also adding your strengths to it and adding +1 for the basher, and that was included in that, then it takes away that unnecessary second dice roll, and it's also then rewarding you for trying to win the fight. And I think that would then work a lot better, and you might see a few people trying to risk that little knockdown rather than it being as situational as it is at the moment. So then there's the one which I'm a huge champion of, and this is feinting. What do you think about feinting, Steve?
Do you know what? I never really seen a problem with feint until you pretty much pointed it out, and it's like, yeah, that does make sense. The fact that you can just feint, like you say, regardless.
Swords are weapons that can be truly deadly in the hands of a trained fighter. Now, of course, the issue with feint is that what it has ended up being is an extra reroll of a 1 for all terrible models and profiles with low fight values who are not skilled fighters, and as a result, it's probably something that should be changed. Yeah. So we've got a bit of a suggestion, which if you watch the GBHL podcast, you'll know what it is. But what is it, Steve?
You can only do it if you're equal or higher fight value.
Equal or higher fight value, because then you aren't doing it risk-free. You're having to make that choice of, oh, well, you know, I'm going to risk where I am. And yes, you might do it then. If you're being supported and the like, you know, then you would feint in that situation. That then makes sense to feint. But I think that having to be equal or higher fight value, it also rings a little bit truer to the fluff of feint too. Now I think that we both agree that stun and whirl are pretty good. You don't see them all the time. They're very, very sort of situational, but there doesn't seem to be much wrong with the rules themselves. But probably the most contested and most debated special strike of all, it's piercing strike. What do we think about piercing strike?
Yeah, it's the fact that you can go up by 3 in strength, so you can be strength 2 or strength 3 and go up to like 5 or 6. It's a bit excessive, and you know, you can have these really lowly warriors taking out a troll, taking out a monster, and it's a bit much. It's a bit much. I think it needs sort of a limit on it. That can stop you doing that to a point. But yeah, it definitely is too much at the minute for certain models to be able to do that. Now
always a really, really visual kind of representation of that is what you then see in metas, particularly competitive metas out there, and it's become part of the meta, of course, that you see axes stuck on so many different armies, new and old, where is possible, because it just does give you that option. If you've got a strength 3 army, the ability to go up to strength 6 in certain situations is incredibly powerful. Now that doesn't ring true to me and many others in lots of ways. You know, I don't think an elf would ever be, well, we say that, but an elf as strong as a troll in the game, for example. So there are a couple of little ideas here. Remember, this piercing strike is currently free as well, so it's always worth comparing your thoughts back towards the two-handed weapons, which of course, you know, +1 to wound, -1 in the dual roll. There's a good kind of penalty there. Now I do like the penalty side of piercing strike. I like the idea that you swing and you miss, that you're caught off guard, that if you lose when you're piercing struck, -D3 defense, I think, is great, because you're off guard, you've shown your back, your armor's not on show, and your opponent has got a much better chance of killing you. But I think just even +1 strength, or even if it was a situation where you could maybe do a D2, effectively a 1 to 3, you got +1, a 4 to 6, but going up by 3, I think, is just a little bit too much. The only reason I'd say maybe having the option to go up to 2 is that then can be the difference between wounding on a 5 or a 6, which is fine, but I think going towards wounding on a 50-50 roll of a 4 against some things just seems a little bit too excessive.
Yeah.
When up against those real high defense things. So that's what we're thinking. +1 strength when you're piercing strike successfully, maybe +2 on a 4+, but definitely keep with the -3 defense. So that is the special strikes. Which brings us on to the missile weapons. Now we actually think that the bows and everything seems pretty fine and reasonably balanced as it looks. We're not talking, of course, at the moment about what profiles have them, but it's another great point to mention. One of the things I think would really include models that we don't see on the battlefield and bring them to the battlefield and bring something to the battlefield. It is, of course, talking about those thrown weapons again. Yeah. Thrown weapons. No penalty to the shoot value when moving. That's the way to fix thrown weapons.
100%.
So we're going to finish up a little bit on war gear now, and I mean, we think that banners are perfectly fine. We see banners in the game. They're reasonably expensive, but you do see them pop up from time again, and they can do a good job. And of course, there are plenty of tournaments which play to the death, of which a banner can be quite important. But one that we don't necessarily see as much of, it's the horn.
Yeah.
It's the horn. Now when we were talking about the horn of course gives battle-wide +1 courage, which is actually pretty good if you think about it. It's actually pretty good. But we don't see it. Now, do you think it's worth 20 points?
The strange thing is, I think we don't see it because it's 20 points, and for 20 points in an army where you may be paying 5, 6, 7 points for your troops, you could get 2 or 3 troops for that. But then again, if it was 15 points, so let's say it was 5 points cheaper, I think that's too cheap for +1 courage across the board.
So let's look at, like, we'll get to this a little bit more. The main problem I think that we see in Horns is that armies that you would probably see them being taken along, of course, are going to be low courage armies, a lot of which are your evil armies, like goblins, like orcs and the like. But the thing which is keeping them out of the game, it's Fury. Fury's keeping out of the game. Now we'll talk about what we think the changes to Fury will be, because Fury absolutely dominates the meta. Absolutely, completely dominates the meta. So you could make Horns ever so slightly cheaper to maybe encourage those being included. Maybe. But I actually think to solve the problem with Horns, it's much better to look at solving the problem with Fury.
Yeah.
So very aptly, that's a lovely segue into looking at magic in the main rulebook. Now, something that you pointed out before we even started talking about magic is that you would like to see heroes having a better opportunity to be able to, and we're talking about big heroes here, a better opportunity to always be able to try and resist a spell. Because of course we all see it, don't we? You bring along your big Aragorn or your big Boromir, and within 2 or 3 turns they're will-less and they are transfixed, immobilized out of the game. Now, we don't necessarily think that anything needs to be looked at in terms of transfix or compel, immobilize and all the like. They seem pretty fine. Maybe you could improve the make it a bit more difficult to cast, but still, there doesn't seem to be too much wrong with that. But you had a little bit of an idea of something that you'd like to see on some of the bigger profiles in the game, didn't you? Yeah,
I think some of the more powerful heroes, the ones that you're paying a lot of points for, if you're paying, you know, somewhere around the mark of 170, 200 points for a hero, for him just to be transfixed out of the game because he's been Sup Will or whatever, it's a shame, and it's a big chunkier army gone. So I think some of the, you know, the 3/3/3 heroes, maybe you could think about giving them some kind of resistance to magic rule where they just get a chance to take a resist roll, and there's always that very slim chance that they can resist that transfix, you know, and scupper your opponent's plans, because otherwise you're a bit of a pawn in your opponent's game, really. I don't know how it could be integrated into the game, you know. I'm not saying give everyone resistance to magic, that's not what I'm saying. But just some way, maybe you could have a 50-50 dice roll to see whether you do get a chance to resist it, something like that. But I just think it would make it more interesting. It would make your opponent have to think more rather than just Sup Will, transfix.
And it would of course make some of those big profiles more viable in the game again, and give us the opportunity to see some of those big dudes on that battlefield, not just in all hero lists, but actually as part of armies, because they're not just going to get transfixed out of the game at those high points costs when they come up against the casters. It's an interesting idea. It's not one that I'd thought about before, but what do you think? Comment below and let us know. So one of the big things when looking at the magic spells is actually looking at some of the channeled versions. So not just the spells themselves, but the channeled versions. And one of the reasons why we'll really go into this is because actually when looking at magic, you also want to be able to look at the appropriate profile which is able to cast the spell. So we'll be doing that when we do exactly the same as this video for the various source books that are out there. What we're going to look at here is we're going to look at Banishment, Drain Courage. We're also going to look at Renew and Strengthen Will and their channeled versions. All of them currently allow you to do the D3 effect rather than the 1, which they would normally do and normally cast. Now the issue with that is you pay that might point and you roll a 1 or a 2.
It's wasted.
It's wasted, and you've paid the currency for it. Now, whilst we all love war games where there is risk and the like, I think when you pay the might currency for it, I think D3 plus 1 is probably going to be the fairest way of looking at it.
Especially when you've already used might to cast in normal circumstances.
Exactly, and that's the way that Sup Will works, even without its channeled version. It's D3 plus 1, recognising that it should allow you to get that little bit more. So when looking at the spells, that's one of the first things that we deal with, is some of the channeled versions of those spells. One of the big ones to talk about is one that we talked about when we mentioned Horns previously, and that is of course the mighty meta consistent force, which is Fury.
Awesome. Fury.
Now of course Fury is currently an exhaustion spell. It's currently an exhaustion spell, so once cast, it goes on for the rest of the game. Now we're going to look at both the channeled version and the actual normal spell. The channeled version allows the save, the fate roll, the special fate roll, to go from a 6+ to a 5+. So all of a sudden, 1 in 6 wounds being saved, it's 1 in 3 wounds, which is incredibly powerful. Now we see Fury a lot.
Yep.
In fact, we see it in most evil armies. So
most of my armies.
most people's armies. So therefore, I think that a lot of people would agree with me that it's probably something that needs to be looked at. What would you do to change Fury?
I quite like Fury, but I do see. I mean, you make a fair point. The only thing that I would say against the point is that if you do make it weaker, are these weaker forces going to suffer? So the forces that you've seen that use Fury now, your goblins, etc., and you see quite a lot of them, would you see a lot less of them if the rules changed? But yeah, you mentioned about the it being a one-off spell unless you channel it.
Yeah, I think that if it was, I think that one of the ways that you could look at fixing Fury, and remember Fury, so yes, you would probably see less, but the thing that makes Fury so great is that it allows an evil army to completely bypass one of its biggest weaknesses, which is of course its courage, and that's why it's so prevalent, because all of a sudden evil armies, horde armies, are all going to be able to swarm in on a monster where normally, you know, their courage wouldn't allow them to do that. You might get 1 or 2 in, but this is going to allow them to automatically do that. Not only that, that means that when you break, you're getting rid of the problem of running away, which again should be one of the trade-offs for going for evil. When you go for evil, usually, unless you go for really elite evil force, you're probably going to have more models, you know, thematically, and when you think of the type of armies that you might see in Middle Earth. But the trade-off for that is that once broken, even though it's harder to break you because you've got so many more models, is that at that point you've got low courage, you run away. Fury negates that. But not only does Fury do that, it then also gives you this special fate roll, this special 6+ fate roll, and when you channel it, it's 5+. It's incredibly powerful, and that's why we see so much of it. So what would I do to change Fury? Well, I would actually make it work a little bit more like Blinding Light. So it actually becomes a temporary spell, meaning that when you cast it, it just works for the remainder of that game turn, or the remainder of that turn. So during that turn, if it's successfully cast, the models that are within 6 inches automatically passed all courage tests that they need to make. So great if, for example, you had broken, or you need to charge a monster, or your battle lines are about to clash and you want that extra save, you want to be getting that 6+ save. That would be brilliant. I think that would work well. But then the channeled version, instead of inexplicably making this fate roll from a 6 to a 5+, I think the channeled version, again, make it like Blinding Light, and it turns it into the exhaustion spell, so you're not having to do it every single turn. Then you've also got a little bit of consistency between a spell for good and a spell for evil on the whole, and I think that would definitely change how we would think about Fury, and also affect metas everywhere. But what do you think? Do you agree with these thoughts about Fury? You know what to do.
Keep Fury.
Comment in the comment section below. Now, possibly one of the most powerful spells that's out there, it's Sup Will. It's Sup Will. Now again, we'll probably talk about the casting values when we actually get to profiles, when we get to ring wraiths that can use this spell and what they can cast it on, because on the whole, it's not that hard to hit, is it? It's not hard. It's a 3+ almost. 3+, 4+.
I hate it. I hate it. I hate the spell.
But we'll get to that, of course, when we get to that kind of area. Okay, so Sup Will. Well, it does seem to be very easy to cast for what it does. Now, remember, normal Sup Will is minus D3 plus 1. D3 plus 1 will points. Now, one of the big things with Sup Will is it, of course, allows a Wraith player, for example, to be able to deal with shamans, which is great. But more importantly, and what you see it for more, is it's diminishing the effect of big heroes, mighty profiles that we would like to see in the game, all of a sudden become a little bit less relevant. It's a very powerful spell. So how do you get around that? How do you make it a little bit less? Well, I think there should be something which is harder to cast.
Harder to cast.
But a consequence.
With a consequence. It touches on what we spoke about before, as to maybe giving some of the bigger heroes a chance to resist, because D3 plus 1, if you're very lucky and you do resist it, they just cast it again next turn, and that's it. It's probably, against heroes, what would you say, it's probably one of barring Transfix, probably the most powerful spell in the game.
Yeah, what you tend to see is a Sup Will be chucked out there. The Sup Will's chucked out, or even just Transfixes to get a will down, but Sup Wills are chucked out there, and of course your hero's got to use his will to try and... There's no point in him using all of it. This is the issue, is because to try and resist, you've got to use will. Now I think that a good way of dealing with that is that if you are successful in resisting against Sup Will, is that you should get a will point back. A will point back, or D3 plus 1 will points back, so you should get that back. But then at the same time there's also the risk for the Sup Will caster, so they actually lose D3. And you could even do it where they lose D3, D3 plus 1, whatever it is, and that the person who managed to resist gets that back, as it were. So it just gives that bit of a risk reward. It means that it's not as straightforward as, right, I'm going to Sup Will and then I'm just going to immobilise and transfix you out the game, and it just gives everybody something to think about.
It's just a very easy tactic, that, and it feels like when you're playing against it, it's just not a lot of thoughts gone into it. It just disheartens you.
You can see it coming. So again, something which is just so powerful in the game. That would be one way that I would look at maybe adjusting Sup Will. So we're up to the special rules section now, special rules, and we're just going to go for a couple of these because a lot of the special rules are absolutely fine. Yeah. One of the ones we maybe looked at was Cave Dweller. You'd like to see Cave Dweller change slightly?
Yeah, I think Cave Dweller should be, for your goblins and your other things that I've got that special rule, it should be like the Woodland Creature, where they can move over certain terrain freely, to an extent. I'm not saying they can climb up vertical walls, but maybe anything that's the same height as them they can get over no problem, and they only take a climb or a jump test if it's higher than the height of the model or something along them lines.
Not something that we see in the game a huge amount, but maybe something there that a few people think would add to those profiles that have Cave Dweller. One that we think that would be well worth a look at is Harbinger of Evil. Harbinger of Evil has a huge battlefield effect. It's on a 12-inch radius each way. That's not diameter, that's radius. It's a huge impact on the battlefield. And although these things don't stack, because you do tend to see multiple ring rays in a lot of the metas, it's something that could perhaps have less. So go for the 6-inch radius.
Yeah, 6-inch radius, because as soon as I mean one wraith, but 2 definitely you just think, right, well that's my army -1.
Yeah, the whole game.
That's it, -1. So 6-inch would still be very difficult to play against, especially if you've got multiples.
Exactly, and it then matches up with things like Blinding Light and Pool of Darkness, and I know that they're very different types of things, but then you've also, it's making something a bit consistent. You know that those types of things, it's a 6-inch radius, and I think that would definitely sort out Harbinger of Evil. Another really interesting one to look at is the Woodland Creature special rule. Now, absolutely nothing wrong with Woodland Creature, but one thing that we did notice when the Desolation of Smaug sourcebook was released was there were some really interesting and quite cool rules for Haven Woods. Now, the issue with this is that because they're optional, we never ever get to see them, and they are clearly being designed to work in conjunction with some of the new profiles, such as Mirkwood Rangers and the like. As such, it does feel sometimes when you're fielding Mirkwood Rangers, which are very expensive, it feels like you're almost missing something. You're almost missing something. It's the same with Bayonne as well. Same with any of these. The whole idea is to make the models fit in with the terrain that they're using. So one way that you could do this is you could allow Woodland Creatures to benefit just as if any wood is a Haven Wood. If you made that a rule that went all the way through, Woodland Creatures, they get that +1 defense. Now this would make a huge difference. All of a sudden Strength 4 is only wounding Bayonne on a 6x4, which seems much more realistic. All of a sudden the Mirkwood Rangers and other Strength 3 Defense 3 models out there would go up to Defense 4, and that would increase them in the meta, wouldn't it? We'd see a lot more.
I think it's a really good idea. I like the idea. It's a cool idea as well. It gets you thinking about cool situations and cool scenarios, and it's not something that people will go, oh well, you're not paying for it. It's gonna break that profile. It's not, because some gaming boards are not going to have any woods on. Some might have one on, some might have one or two, and then the elves would have to sit in there. It's just sort of a haven, like you say, for them to get to if they're fighting against monsters or things like that, and it just adds a nice cool thing.
It brings them back into. It brings them back into.
It'd be nice to see more of them.
And it seems to be that a lot of the new profiles are written with that in mind, with those terrain rules in mind. It would certainly bring the likes of Bayon, who's very, very expensive, bring him back to the table, and it would make, you know, you would start thinking, well, actually 14 points for Mirkwood Rangers, I'll bring them. If they're in a wood, all of a sudden a lot of the things which dominate in the meta, such as Hurl, Sorcerer's Blast and Strength 3 shooting at the moment, a lot of those kind of things would be negated by this special bonus that you could give to Woodland Creature. Just a suggestion, what do you guys think? So we're coming towards the end of our little video here of rules that we would like to see Middle Earth SBG. And just a couple of little ones now. We're going to skim over them because there's some stuff that we never ever see. We're going to very quickly talk about siege engines. Now neither of us are particularly qualified to talk about siege engines, are we?
No, I've not used them very often. I've used a Vault Thrower once or twice in friendly games, but yeah, you don't see them very often. And there's a reason for that. It's because the profiles aren't great.
And not many people know the siege rules, so maybe the siege rules themselves are maybe slightly complicated. They seem to work all right when I have sort of played with them, but we don't see a lot of it. So again, if you're going to look at something and say, well, maybe that could be tweaked so that more people would play with those rules, then that could be something you look at. But I think when talking about siege engines, it's probably going to be when we look and scan through the profiles themselves and see what we could do, where they would increase their battlefield effectiveness, and then of course see them on a table near you very, very soon. And the very final thing that we're going to talk about in the Hobbit Strategy Battle Gaming Rulebook of changes that we'd like to see is, of course, one of the final rules that's in there is actually a rule that you cannot play in point values games. It's a scenario specific rule which leaves for a lot of wishful thinking. Here's, of course, the passenger rules. Yeah, it'd be cool to be able to carry passengers. It would also let you use that cool model with Legolas and Gimli on horseback. Oh, that'd be amazing. I don't understand why it's not in the game. It would be nice to see it, and yeah, it just add another aspect to it. You know, you need to get a certain character that's not on horseback from one part of the battlefield to another, and you could carry him on your horse. It just adds something else, and then, you know, target priority and things like that. It just changes a lot of the things that you're going to be going for in the game. I think it's a really good idea. I think it should be in there. Yeah, the rules are already written for it, and because there are already rules for it, it's not something that would need to be thought about much more. So as such, you could maybe just include the fact that they are now allowed in points games, and it would just change the game that little bit again and allow for some cool situations without bogging it down too much. The rules are already written, so why not play with them? That brings us to the end of our review of the changes that we would like to see. These opinions are, of course, just the opinions of myself and Steve here, things that we would like to see tweaked, changed, or even just looked at going into Middle Earth Strategy Battle Gaming. We are no voices or authority, but we really want to get that conversation going between ourselves as a channel and, of course, the community out there. So if there's anything that you think that you would like to see in Middle Earth Strategy Battle Gaming as it goes forward into its new lease of life in the months to come, make sure that you comment below and get involved in the conversation. You've been here with GBHL James
and Steve,
and we will be back reviewing the first of the source books that we'll be looking at to have a little bit of a look and see what profiles we would like to see changed and meddled about with going into Middle Earth Strategy Battle Game going forward. Don't forget to comment, like, share and subscribe to support your Hobbit hobby.
Happy Strategy Battle Gaming.